This is the Wright Brothers Ranch, and it was formally established in 1874. Uh, we're actually looking behind us at the home of Ben and Arvetta Wright when they got married in 1927. Uh, the it's interesting. This house is where Ben, my grandfather, was born in 1899. That house is where his father, Benjamin, uh, built a two-room house in 1874 when he had already had probably 5, 6 kids. He ultimately had 21 children. Uh, it was my great-grandmother, Mary. She died in 1921. So for 22 years, she maintained this property. And what we're looking at really is the homestead. And we're looking down from actually property that was subdivided amongst the children of Benjamin, because he started off with over 200 acres and he subsequently divided it off amongst his children. And what we've done in the last, my father, Herman Wright, and my uncle Clinton Wright acquired most of that land back, as well as their mother's land, and that's what makes up the Wright Brothers Ranch. So behind you is that homestead, that the place where my dad was born, my grandfather was born, my great grandfather, who was born in 1843, started this at that location. So, we're talking about 140 years from today in terms of history.
So this is your home, but you weren't born here.
No, no, I wasn't, and I think that's one of the things that's interesting. Has always been interesting to me. The reason I'm so connected to it is that my mother, who has been, ill for a large portion of my life, was not able to take care of me when I was born, and so she delivered me to my grandmother to this house, and I spent my first year of my life in this house. In fact, the thing that my wife laughs about is the fact that my first word was biscuit, and in fact, that's my greatest memories of eating and fresh food. People talk about going green. I was green. I was born green, and I lived here my first year. And while you can't remember that, I keep coming back. I kept coming back. Uh, I always considered myself something. She had 4 sons. They had 4 sons, Ben and Arvetta, and I always considered myself a little closer as a grandchild than the other grandchildren. Not quite a son, but I just became. I wanted to be around her. I wanted to be around my grandfather, but I wanted to be around her, and because she was my role model. As early as I can remember, she's always been there. She's always been a presence in my life. She's always been a driver for me. If my dad actually, and my uncle actually said that, everything I've done I owe to her. I can actually say that too. And that house represents who I am. It represents the legacy that I come from. And in fact, it's funny. When people go, well, you go back to that house. That house is 1874. Actually, the story goes back to 1819. And they're not related to me. James and Rachel Frazier came from Virginia, and if you go to the cemetery, there's a tombstone, very ornate tombstone, for both of them. actually at the summit of the cemetery. And you know, it's interesting. On the tombstone, it says, "Born in Virginia, 1819," for her. Or for him. I'm sorry. It says born in Virginia in 1819 for him, and born in Virginia in 1820 for her, James and Rachel. You know, you look at that and you go, what? The speculation is that they could read and write. And they came from Virginia, obviously as part of the great domestic slave trade. And they were here when Sheridan and Alexander Wright bought this land from the Mexican government in 1835. So they were probably 13, 14 years old. And they came as a couple, which was very unusual. I mean, when does that happen? And as slaves. And they were bought and brought here. And as far as anyone's memory can tell, you know, they really were the leaders of the community. And their daughter, Mariah, who was my great-grandfather's, close to his age, married him in like 1858. And they had a bunch of kids, like 10 kids. And, you know, Mariah, and we have a great photo of them, probably not their wedding photo, but, you know, a really expensive photo technology went into making that photo. And they were a couple who basically settled this land. She was James and Rachel's daughter. So we pretty much believe that they had a lot to do, if you look at where they're buried, that they had a lot to do with negotiating with the Wrights, the Sheridan Alexander Wright's family, and ultimately Solomon Wright, who we don't know this, but we suspect may have fathered Benjamin in 1843, is when he was born. But because in 1876 he gave a deed to Benjamin and others who were part of those original 20 slave families that are part of our folklore, our story. And that's where that house came from. That's you know, you don't see it now, but there were 2 huge oak trees in front of that house. And our speculation is that those were planted by Benjamin and by Mariah. And they've since died only in the last 10 years. And a new young one is growing up, which is an interesting story that tells about this legacy continuing. But, you know, the thing that's amazing to me is just how we've been able to maintain this land, this place. And we were honored recently for having it in continuous agricultural production for over 100 years. Well, that says a lot. It talks about Benjamin. It talks about his son, and Ben was his youngest son, his baby, when he died. It talks about my dad and my Uncle Clinton, my dad Herman Wright Sr., and it talks about me having spent my first year here and getting my blood intertwined with the soil. And so in the 21st century, here I am, part of that legacy that goes on. And we really do consider this a legacy that was started by James and Rachel. So we think of this legacy as approaching 190 years. And to me, I got that in my blood. And my grandmother, Arvetta, was primarily responsible for that. She talked and talked and talked, and it just went in deeper and deeper and deeper.